I've been playing Deadlock since the alpha opened for the general gamer, and I'm telling you, it's good. Like, really good. Like, so good, I have to get up and force myself to stop playing good. Good enough that I have half a mind to grind it out and rise to the ranks, even after I told myself I would never no-life a competitive multiplayer game again. Deadlock does so much right, but in the back of my mind, I can't help but feel like its future as a major competitive esport is somewhat limited, and that it'll have to do more to break out in this very crowded market. I'm an enormous Valve fan, and I do hope that this take ages poorly, but when I think about it, something tells me it'll be a bit too hard for Deadlock, in its current form, to build the player base it needs, because it's too complex and too similar to Dota and other MOBAs. It's so polished, even in its early alpha state, and does so many things right, but something tells me that the most polished gameplay and interesting characters in the world won't end up saving Deadlock from its own concept. What's Valve been up to lately? Valve's been riding pretty high off the backs of Dota and Counter-Strike. They've consistently been two of the top competitive games for well over a decade, but at the same time, Valve wasn't able to capture the magic for their attempt at a competitive card game, Artifact, or their auto-battler, Dota Underlords. These games certainly had the Valve polish, but they weren't able to take market share away from their competitors Hearthstone and Teamfight Tactics respectively. They died relatively quick deaths. Meanwhile, my personal favorite, Team Fortress 2, enjoys a steady casual player base most other devs would kill for, but it hasn't received much in the way of content updates in years, and sad as it is to say, the competitive scene is dead. Not dying, dead. TF2 is one of my all-time favorite games, and I'll always have fun messing around, but besides solving the bot problem recently, great on Valve for doing that by the way, you can't even really say it's an officially supported title anymore. I'll take what I can get these days. You won't hear me complaining as long as Valve keeps the TF2 servers on, but it's just not a cutting-edge competitive title anymore. That sphere of the gaming world passed it by a long time ago. But then over the summer, we started hearing murmurs that Valve could be developing a new hero shooter after leaked video and screenshots started making the rounds. My imagination ran wild at that point. Now it was making some sense why Team Fortress hadn't got a meaningful content update in however long. Valve, as we know, is allergic to the number 3, so I assume they weren't out and out making Team Fortress 3, but could they be making a spiritual successor? Something that follows in TF2's footsteps, while bringing it in line with the past 15 plus years of gameplay innovations and conventions. TF2 may be perfect, there's a reason why we all keep coming back, but there's also a reason it's not a viable competitive game today. These reports of a mysterious new hero shooter came out in about May, and of course none of us had any idea how long it would be before we had any concrete details, or when we'd even be able to get to play any of it. Knowing, or at least thinking, that there was an actual Team Fortress 3 type thing in development was plenty for me, and I assumed it would be months or years, like a long time until we got to play it. Then one day in August, I got an email telling me I was invited to the Deadlock playtest, and I got over the moon super excited. Could it be that Valve was inviting the biggest YouTubers in on their secret project? Not exactly. It turns out I got let in by one of my TF2 friends, but all of a sudden, it turned out I was going to be able to play whatever hero shooter Valve was cooking up way sooner than I'd ever thought. Valve's guerrilla marketing strategy almost deserves its own video, and several already exist. But basically, they gave players unlimited invites to pass out to their Steam friends, but the catch is, you couldn't post anything about the game, or really discuss it online in any way outside Valve's official dev forum. I remember those early days before the embargo lifted, where it really felt like you were in on this big secret, and like you got to be present from the creation of something huge. And the best part was, the game was amazing. I was instantly hooked and already fantasizing about climbing the ladder, and the ladder didn't even exist yet. The first thing I realized about Deadlock, it's not Team Fortress 3, and it's really a lot more Ice Frog than it is Robin Walker. Team Fortress is the original hero shooter, but it came into this world as a Quake mod, so it's got arena shooter roots. Deadlock, on the other hand, is a MOBA through and through. so it's got real-time strategy roots. Real quick, in case you've never played something like League or Dota, MOBAs are born out of a Warcraft 3 mod, and they kind of displace StarCraft and other real-time strategy games on the esports scene. In a typical MOBA, you join up as one of a team of 5 heroes placed in 3 lanes, and the object of the game is to advance the lane, knock down the other team towers along the way before they get to yours, and storm their base to win the match. Deadlock is built around all these concepts, from the top level objective, to last hitting the lane creeps, to the fact that a bunch of the hero abilities are straight copy-pasted out of Dota. I'm not saying that like it's a bad thing, they just are. The quickest way to describe it is start with Dota, and then shift the camera from the top level down to where you'd expect it in a third-person shooter, and that's literally Deadlock. Deadlock is 6 players per team instead of 5, and it's 4 lanes instead of 3, but the format is so thoroughly MOBA that if you want to play well, it's really a lot more important to understand how MOBAs work than it is to have strong deathmatch shooter experience. You're better off coming from something like League or Dota than from TF2 or Counter-Strike. So what's the appeal? This is me playing Deadlock, and the way you know it's me is because I'm moving my character around like a scrub. If you look up gameplay footage from high MMR lobbies, it'll look like a totally different game, and I think that's great. I think the single best thing about Deadlock that I'm certain Valve got right is the high movement skill ceiling. A successful competitive game has got to be rewarding for the player and a spectacle for the viewer, and I think one of the biggest keys to achieving this is interesting movement with a high skill ceiling. Think of super pervasive games like Mario 64, Super Smash Bros. Melee, or even something like Rocket League. A player can sink infinite time into these games and never fully master the movement. And it's also engaging for the spectator because they get to see the pros play in almost a totally different way than they do casually. I think a lot of games fall into the trap of being very fun to play, but not super exciting to watch, and that limits the audience. Just like it should be easy enough for people who have never played before to follow the action, it should also be inherently interesting, and something people would feel like they want to learn more about. Whether you're watching a traditional sport or it's an esport, my theory is that a lot of what keeps people coming back is they appreciate the skill and the strategy. You might start off with only a surface level understanding and focused on the flashy plays, but if it's interesting, you'll watch more, and if you watch more, you'll learn more, and eventually you'll build that appreciation for what's going on. That causes a loop where you keep coming back for more, and the game grows. This is a big leg up from League or Dota. As somebody who's not super deep into Dota, but has played a few hundred matches, there's obviously more pro movement in that game, but at the end of the day, you're just clicking the map and waiting for the character to walk to the spot, as opposed to an action game like this, where you have a full range of motion. And I think this is a big leg up. In Deadlock, what's going on is you've got a dash, and if you time it correctly, you could do a dash jump, and you can extend that into a slide. Sliding also grants you infinite ammo as long as you're sliding, so you're double rewarded with speed and power. And then as if that weren't enough, every hero has a melee attack, which you can sort of use to shift your momentum around, either on the ground or in the air. There's also rails going up and down the lanes, so there's a certain skill to building up speed using the rail, and then jumping off at the right time to slide down a ramp. On top of all this, there are even certain heroes whose abilities give them extra mobility options, so basically there's a ton going on besides just holding down W to walk forward. Oh, and I didn't even mention that there's wall jumping. In my 30 or 40 so matches, I super do not have the hang of chaining my movement into ramps, positioning around the ramps, or even built up the muscle memory to slide every time I should be. But the idea that Deadlock is more than just positioning and shooting, I think is a great thing that makes it extra watchable for spectators while adding a good layer of complexity for the player. For what it's worth, I'll also say that even in this early stage, all the controls and inputs feel tight, responsive, and satisfying. Deadlock may be an alpha, in the sense that Valve is still experimenting with the characters and their interactions, and the balance is going to change a lot, but what's there is polished like a full release. It shouldn't be a huge surprise that Valve knows how to throw together a shooter with responsive controls, but nothing's a given these days, so I just thought I'd mention. I also have to say, I am a fan of the third-person perspective, and definitely think Valve made the right call here. Shooters do tend to lend themselves to first-person, but I think first-person would have been too limiting for the player, because there's a lot of spells and just crap flying around in this game, and more importantly, I think third person creates a much better viewing experience for the spectator. After my time with Team Fortress 2, I'm not really convinced first-person shooters are as interesting to watch as third-person, especially for the uninitiated. I think the constrained field of view makes it that much harder to follow what's going on, and ultimately limits the appeal. Another genius innovation in Deadlock is the way it handles last hits. Real quick, in a MOBA, the main way you build up your XP to power up your hero and earn money to buy items is by killing the CPU-controlled NPCs, which are called creeps, that run up and down the lane. The catch is, you only get the XP and the gold if you land the last hit, or another way of saying killing blow, on the NPC. In Dota, there's another mechanic on top of that called denying, which is when you last hit an enemy's creep and steal the golden XP for yourself. In Deadlock, what's going on is whenever a creep, player, or tower goes down, you'll see these orbs float out of the body, and the orbs will either be colored green if they're your team's, or orange if they were generated by the enemy. In League or Dota, the points are awarded the moment the kill is registered, but here you don't get the XP until somebody shoots the orb. Also, if nobody shoots the orb, eventually it'll disintegrate and the money goes to whichever side generated the kill, so you don't have to waste your time shooting the orb if you know for sure there's no enemy in the area to contest your kill. I really like this mechanic because it adds another dimension to the gunplay. In a MOBA, you need to balance harassing the enemy with securing your last hits. You can't do too much of one or else you'll fall behind on the other. So now in Deadlock, that dynamic still exists, but it's not enough just to get the last hit anymore, you also have to make sure to shoot the orb. I think this works because it takes advantage of the fact that Deadlock is a shooter, and it adds another skill check in a way that's extremely straightforward. I need money, shoot the orb, I get money. I also think Valve is doing something right with the heroes and the abilities. The powers are fun and varied, certain characters are definitely harder to learn than others, so you can pick up a hero based on the type of gun they use, but also based on the sort of abilities they pop and how straightforward they are to learn. Aesthetically, I also really like the theme, which is like 1920s Al Capone gangster New York with magical abilities. So it's doing a lot of things right. Why am I pessimistic about a game that's the most fun I've had in ages? I'm pessimistic because I'm worried the esports market is possibly oversaturated today, and I think the way to break into it is to do something easier to digest than League and Dota, not more confusing. My main hangup is you need to set aside serious upfront time to learn this game, plus Valve is making substantial changes regularly, which is great fun if you're invested, but it makes it so you need to pay really close attention and stay up to date, even if you're read up. MOBAs tend to have a ton of equipable items. Deadlock is no exception, it's got over 100 already, and you need to learn all these and think about what to buy every game based on some combination of what makes your character stronger, what counters the heroes that you're up against, and just the general game state. The best, most accessible games are easy to learn, hard to master, and this is not what I'd call easy to learn. There's actually a ton going on, and it's not really the type of thing that you could just boot into and understand intuitively. You're going to have to do a lot of reading and experimenting, even if you're not trying to go pro. It's also not just the items, because if it were, you could just follow a build guide and go along with your day. When you first drop into a match, there's abilities flying all over the place, there's stuff happening to you and your teammates, and it's not immediately clear what it is or where it's coming from. If you think back to TF2, it's just people shooting each other, and the only real ability in that game is the medic's Uber gun. So the only thing you really have to learn is the differences between the weapons and the damage properties. In Deadlock, every character is a weapon, but they've also got 3 abilities, plus a 4th ultimate ability, and there's items you can buy to give you even more active abilities. So you can follow a build guide all you want, but eventually you're going to have to figure out the powers at your disposal and how to use them, and the different types of things that can happen to you. Plus, of course, Valve is always adding new content and changing stuff around. It's definitely a lot. If you have a background in Dota, you'll obviously have a leg up in all this, but you'll also need to learn a new map, which is somewhat more complex because there's one more lane and one more hero per side. A game like this can be extremely satisfying to learn, and it is doable. There's no secrets, it's a big, well-documented game, the info's all out there for those who take the time to look, but I think the complexity is going to ultimately hold Deadlock back in the long run. Something just tells me that people aren't going to want to commit the time to learning all the bare minimum mechanics they need, not to just get steamrolled immediately. So I'm making the argument that Deadlock could be too complex, but the counter there is League is plenty complex, And it's pretty much been the biggest game for years. My response to that would be, maybe so, but League came up and got big in a totally different time. I would say you can't really compare the environment League got popular in to today's market that Deadlock is trying to enter. What is the esports landscape today? For the big boys, you have Counter-Strike and Valorant on one side, you have League and Dota on the other, and Fortnite sort of sitting in between. I would then call COD, PUBG, Rainbow Six, Apex Legends, and Rocket League Tier 2. Marvel Rivals is the new flavor of the month. Overwatch is basically dead, and Concord is actually dead. Plus, there's also the Destiny and Warframe looter shooters of the world. Not exactly the same thing, but another option for people who want to get into a game. That's a really, really crowded market, especially compared to the early 2010s when League was becoming popular and it was basically the only free game available to play. I guess other than RuneScape. So where does Deadlock fit in here? One way to look at it is to say, okay, the good news is there's a ton of disenfranchised Overwatch and Team Fortress players, and they might be ready to commit to a new competitive ladder. That's not wrong. I'm in the disenfranchised TF2 player camp myself, but how many people like me are really out there? And do they really want to play a MOBA? I would say to get Dota or Counter-Strike numbers, Valve would either have to siphon significant players off an existing mainstay title, or create a brand new market. And I'm not so sure Deadlock is the right game to do that. You could say Deadlock is that game to create a new market because it plays great, and it really is the best synthesis of MOBA and third-person shooter out there. That's certainly true as far as it goes, but I'm not really sure someone who's playing League or Dota actively today secretly wishes their MOBA had gunplay mechanics. It's an interesting curiosity, but this could be a synthesis nobody really asked for. Similarly, is there anybody today who's playing a ton of Fortnite who wishes they could add MOBA lane play? What Valve's put together is already super impressive, but I'm not really sure who they made this for. Someday, a new game we could have never conceived of will come along and create a bigger market for itself than any competitive game today truly enjoys. But I think that game will be more similar to something like Rocket League or Fortnite complexity-wise than something that's even harder to understand than existing offerings. I think Dota is super rewarding to learn, but the answer is not to take that as your starting point and make it even more confusing. Think of a traditional sport like baseball, basketball, soccer, or hockey. There's obviously a huge skill ceiling, but the basics are simple to grasp. Hit the ball, run around the bases, put the ball through the hoop, the puck in the net, etc. I think the concept needs to be super simple to generate interest and build that player base, not more complex. The way you engage with Deadlock is different than Dota, because obviously you're shooting, but I think the objective is actually too similar to Dota. It's actually really almost the exact same objective. Dota's objective is great for Dota, but if you want to stand out from the crowd, doing something new, I think that's somewhere you should be innovating. I'll never forget how hard my mind was blown the first time I ever played Gold Rush, and I think you need something like a payload or a battle royale level gameplay innovation to really see numbers or to convince existing players to migrate off what they're currently playing. For Deadlock to break out in this market, I think Valve needs to work in additional objectives and make whatever concepts they go with a lot simpler. It could be that the map transforms and there are various objectives based around that, or maybe they have new maps that are built around the objectives like they do in TF2. I love objectives. It should probably be something with an offense and a defense, or at the very least something fluid where you score points off each other. Think like Splatoon. Who knows? Valve may well be working on extra modes, or even a map editor. I just think it would make sense to have a little bit more variety going on, other than leaning fully into recreating Dota with guns. I would always think that the more options you have, the more players it can draw in. This is more controversial, but I also think that they would really do well to simplify things, either by dumbing down the map, reducing the amount of items in the game, or reducing the amount of slots you can equip, or some combination. On the one hand, I definitely don't feel like this is going to happen, because it's just not the type of thing it looks like Valve is making, but on the other, I really think what they have now is going to be a little bit hard to entice people to get into the game. Changes or no changes, I've definitely got my eye on Deadlock. I'm a huge Valve guy, I'm rooting hard for Deadlock's success, and I hope it turns out that I'm dead wrong. I just don't think that the answer is something that's less accessible than what we have now, while also being somewhat similar. But who knows? Deadlock is in very active development, and Valve has been really good about responding to the community and implementing changes. Also, the game plays great and is backed by Valve, so it's going to get more than its fair shake. But what are your thoughts? Have you played Deadlock? Have you been enjoying it at all? Do you think it'll end up as the next Dota? Or as the next Dota Underlords? Either way, I cannot wait to see what happens next. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon.